Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here this evening. Let me start by acknowledging the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations on whose traditional territories we're privileged to gather for tonight's event. My name's Andrew Petter. I'm president of Simon Fraser University, and I'm just delighted to be here for the Munro Lecture, which is also the final lecture in the President's 2015 Dream Colloquium series on traveling for health. The Munro Lecture honors former Vice President Academic and Provost Jacques Munro, a significant builder of SFU's academic programs, and it was established in 2001 to bring renowned speakers and scholars to SFU. I'm delighted that Jacques could join us today, together with his partner Sheila Roberts and SFU President Emeritus Jack Blaney, and I'd ask them to give a wave so that we can acknowledge them for being here this evening. Thank you very, very much. It's fitting that the Munro Lecture is forming part of this Dream Colloquium. SFU's Dream Colloquium was launched in 2012 to create a forum for interdisciplinary engagement among SFU students, faculty, staff, and indeed members of the broader community on themes likely to draw interest across the university. This year's Dream Colloquium also forms part of Simon Fraser University's 50th anniversary program, which is one of many special events and initiatives highlighting our 50 years as an engaged university. Students from diverse disciplines are enrolled for credit in the colloquium, providing them opportunities to learn not only from faculty members and guest speakers, but also from each other. In fact, we get three wonderful benefits from this colloquium. We get great speakers like the one we have tonight. We get a program that students can participate in and learn not only from the guest speakers and faculty members, but from each other. And we get the opportunity to have some real interdisciplinary engagement on important issues that have in some cases led to some wonderful research endeavors. By fostering interdisciplinary dialogue, nurturing advanced research, and promoting a supportive learning environment, the Dream Colloquium is also very reflective of SFU's vision to be an engaged university, one that tries to foster a dynamic integration of innovative education, cutting-edge research, and far-reaching community engagement. We're excited that in January 2016, we'll be hosting another colloquium on engaging big data. So I hope you'll take time to join us for some of the lectures in that, and some students will take the opportunity to enroll in the course associated with the colloquium. This evening we will hear the final lecture in this colloquium on traveling for health. Our world is increasingly shaped by movements of people pursuing better health, whether as patients, researchers, medical professionals, or indeed, as we know all too well recently, as refugees. These movements have enormous impacts on the development and availability of new medicines, on the quality of health care available to Canadians, and on health equity around the world. This colloquium has provided a wonderful opportunity to explore these and other issues. Of course, none of this would have been possible without the inspiration and the dedication of the faculty members who conceived this colloquium. All the President's Office really does is invite proposals from faculty from different disciplines. And in this case, we have had faculty members step up and work very hard to make this colloquium possible. I want to particularly acknowledge Dr. Jeremy Snyder from the Faculty of Health Sciences, Dr. Genevieve Fuji-Johnson from the Department of Political Science, and Dr. Valerie Crooks, Canada Research Chair in Health Service Geographies, who's also hosting this evening's reception. And thanks as well to Gladys Wee and the Graduate Studies Office, who helped to organize the Dream Colloquium and have helped to organize this particular colloquium. This afternoon, we're honored to host Harvard professor Glenn Cohen, who will speak on the topic of circumvention tourism. And I know that you, like me, are looking forward to hearing his insights. You'll also have an opportunity to share your ideas and questions during the discussion period to follow, and you're also welcome to continue the conversation at a reception which will follow tonight's presentation. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Jeremy Snyder, who will introduce tonight's guest speaker. Jeremy?
Thank you, President Petter. And I just wanted to reiterate some of the thank yous that President Petter mentioned to particularly the President's Office for the funding that made this lecture series, including tonight's lecture possible, to Jacques Munro for helping to sponsor tonight's lecture. As President Petter mentioned, we will have a reception afterwards, which is being supported by Valerie Crooks and the Canadian Research Chair Program. So we hope you all can stick around a little bit following the talk for that. And as President Petter mentioned, we have enormous support from Gladys Wee. And Gladys, if you could just stand up a moment. If it weren't for Gladys, this would be, I wouldn't be standing here, you wouldn't be here. I would be weeping somewhere in a corner. So thank you so much, Gladys, for all your help throughout the semester and with this program. So I just want to welcome Glenn Cohen, who will be speaking about circumventing legal restrictions to travel abroad for medical care, or Circumvention Tourism. Glenn is a professor of law at Harvard University and a director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard University. He's written on a broad range of topics, so including tonight's topic, but also globalization and health, law, and the legal implications of that, reproduction technology in particular. He's doing work around concussions in the NFL. That's certainly an issue that's been coming up in Canadian news quite recently. And really, most recently wrote the book on medical tourism, so has a fantastic book out within the last year on patients with passports from Oxford University Press. Just a fantastic book and a leading scholar in this area, so we're very lucky to have him. And I want to add to that, Glenn flew in yesterday on what I believe is the busiest travel day in North America. This all sounded like a good idea when we were planning this out months ago, but I want to thank him for doing that. And he is spending, while he is a Canadian, he is spending American Thanksgiving with us tonight. I've been assured we'll have some turkey-based desserts, not really, but at the reception, but hopefully it'll make a nice Thanksgiving meal for him. So thanks so much for coming out, Glenn, but particularly on a weekend like this. Thanks.
Thank you very much for having me. How is that on the sound? Okay, everybody can hear me well? Great, I'm going to move this one out of the way. Thank you to President Petter. Thank you, Mr. Monroe. These two are, this is the dream colloquium, but these two are dream collaborators, I've got to say. I have traveled the world with them to do this kind of work, and it's a perfect marriage of philosophy, health geography, and what I bring to the table most of the time when I can is law. So I want to talk today about people who travel for healthcare and how to think about that. My device is not cooperating, so I'm going to reload it, but luckily I know the first couple things that I'm going to say before I bring up my notes. And essentially what I want to talk about today is I want to start at a very high level, which is to talk about the globalization of healthcare. And here what I want to say is that we should think of medical tourism as being one part of a larger picture. And the way this dream colloquium has been organized really reflects that, I think. So medical tourism, which is the travel of patients from one place, their home country, to another place, the destination country, is just one piece of the puzzle when it comes to globalization. Before I talk specifically about medical tourism, I just want to put this in perspective. Healthcare expenditures in the United States, to use the place I now live, are roughly about 18% of the GDP and projected to grow significantly. Even in a country like Canada that keeps its expenditures low by OECD standards, right, very high quality for relatively low cost, you could easily spend your entire GDP just on healthcare. Well, elsewhere in the world, we've had this kind of revolution in the last 100 years, which is the revolution of globalization. My iPad, my tie, almost everything we consume has some tie to production outside of the home country. And this is in part because in 1817, David Ricardo, the British economist, one of the most important insights in history, the idea of comparative advantage, a fundamental argument in favor of trade. Ricardo argued that even if one country is better at everything, highly specialized and better at everything, it can benefit from trade by focusing on what it's even better at and trading for the things it's less good at. And of course, this has been applied to a large sum of products. But one product that until very recently it has not been applied to is healthcare, right? But we're really entering this phase of healthcare becoming a globalized good. Why only consume healthcare produced locally when you could consume healthcare produced globally as well? To what extent should healthcare be delivered globally? Well, these kinds of globalizations that I've put up here are the product of this new way of thinking, and they're interrelated. Medical worker migration, the subject of one of the other elements of the DREAM colloquium. A large number of the physicians we rely on in Canada and the United States, foreign trained, foreign produced, and a lot of foreign investment in their training. Some places for medical tourism are both sources for tourism, and they're destinations for tourism, and sources for doctors for migration. So there's a little bit of an ebb and flow, and there's some who think medical tourism may help stave off medical migration. But there's lots of other places, like Ghana, for example, which are not destinations for medical tourism, but are sources of outflowing migration, and lots of interesting questions that Professor Snyder, among others, have written about the ethics of this, whether this is a form of exploitation or something else. Telemedicine, people stay put. Doctor and patient stay put, but through telepsychiatry or even telerobotics, a procedure is performed from halfway across the world. R&D, multi-regional clinical trials, which are now very much the norm, where the products you develop through these multi-regional clinical trials may not be deployed ultimately in the country where you do it, or certainly not in a way that's available to most people there. How should we think about the ethics of this and the legal restrictions on all this? So all of these are flowing together. They're part of a complex whole, but I want to zone in on one piece of it, which is the question of medical tourism. So this is a very typical ad for medical tourism trying to recruit you. It's a very lucrative business, growing, largely unregulated. In between the patient and the foreign facility are facilitators. These are individuals who promise to help you choose a facility, arrange for your evaluation, guide you, and even arrange for tourism there. So many people object to the term medical tourism and think it's pejorative, but actually, in fact, tourism is a big piece of what's being sold here. And indeed, you'll see it's very typical to share an image of glamour. I've always found this particular ad a little bit funny, right? Is the implication that they're going to do the surgery on that, surgery on that pontoon up there? I'm not quite sure what they had in mind with this. Oh, there it is. That pontoon over there, is that where I'm going to get my rhinoplasty or my hip replacement done? But it involves these kind of promises of lavish beauty, of glamour, and really spa and wellness is a big piece of this puzzle. So what I want to talk about, though, is in some ways the dark side of this. And by the way, again, the tourism aspect is completely true. Often, a cardiac bypass in India may be paired with a trip to the Taj Mahal and some sightseeing. My favorite example is what's called a surgery safari. You know, you go get a facelift and then you go on safari because presumably the giraffes don't care what you look like when you're out there in the RV. So there's a funny side of this, there's a glamorous side of this, but in the talk today I want to focus on kind of the dark side of this. So this is the slide where I'm supposed to hawk my book, right? Perfect for Christmas, Kwanzaa, whatever, maybe not for young children, right? But I spent a few years writing a book on this subject, and I'm going to talk about half of the book. So it's useful to think of medical tourism as cupping in a few different slices. There's different ways of slicing it. And this, by the way, is Bumrungrad Hospital in Thailand, in Bangkok, one of the industry leaders. Looks very much like a nice conference hotel, if you've ever been to one before, right? So we can divide the world of medical tourism into at least 3 buckets. Medical tourism for services that are legal in the patient's home country and destination country. Hip replacement, cardiac bypass, rhinoplasty. These are very typical examples of this. Medical tourism for services that are legal in the destination but not the home country of the patient, which I'll call circumvention tourism. This is going to be the second half of my talk tonight. Things like travel for abortion, travel for assisted suicide, stem cell therapies, female genital cutting, other examples of reproductive technology. And then finally, medical tourism for services that are illegal in both the destination and the home country, but where you have a greater chance of accessing it because of a laxer enforcement mechanism. And this is going to be the portion of my talk devoted to talking about transplant tourism, which is probably the best example of this. And this is essentially the way the book is structured. So today I'm going to basically tell you a little bit about these chapters. But during Q&A, if you want to talk about the legal side of the industry and some of the ethical and legal issues raised by that, I'm happy to do so. You can also think a little bit about medical tourism in terms of who pays. This is more relevant, I think, on the legal side than the illegal side. On the illegal side, it's almost always self-pay by the consumer. But on the legal side of it, there's also private insurers that are cutting checks, for example, to people in the US to get them to go to Costa Rica for their gastric bypass. waiving deductibles and copays, paying for their travel, giving them time off, and then giving them a check on top of it. Because it turns out the amount of savings available from a country like the United States to go to a place like India are huge, and insurance companies can afford to pay this. There are public systems, mostly in Europe, where there's a European directive, that will pay for your cross-border health care. And indeed, in Canada, every province has a system whereby if the wait time is long enough or something is unavailable in Canada, you can apply for reimbursement ahead of time and authorization ahead of time to go abroad to the United States. Well, usually the United States, it could be somewhere else. And just to give you a sense of what this looks like, I think I'm having trouble moving this. There we go. This is just a chart. So one thing that hopefully other speakers have said, but I'll say it too, all numbers you see about this industry should be taken with a large grain of salt, because while there are some careful researchers who do very good data-based work here, for the most part, a lot of the numbers you get comes from the industry itself. And it's not people necessarily trying to be malicious. It just means that they are measuring different things. Now, with that disclaimer, let me show you some numbers, right? Just to give you a sense, probably correct within an order of magnitude, not more than that. So take the line for angioplasty. Or let's take heart bypass. US retail price, $210,000. Insurer pays about half of that through bargaining and negotiating. Go to India, Thailand, or Singapore, huge cost savings. Usually you're saving 80% of the cost of the procedure. And that's relatively true for many of the procedures involved in medical tourism. And this is more data. This one is EU data, including among others. So we can come back to this if you want to talk about it. But just take my word for it that a lot of this is cost motivated, especially in countries that don't have universal health care or which a particular service is not covered by universal health care. We can also talk about the ways in which patients flow. And Professor Labonte, who I know spoke to you earlier in this colloquium, I borrow this division from him. We say north and we say south here, but we're really talking about it in economic terms, not geographic terms. So Australia would be considered a north-north. Australia to the US would be a north-north transfer. For the purposes of circumvention tourism, we're talking about some north-north travel, in particular travel to the United States for reproductive technology from Western Europe. And then we're talking about a fair amount of north-south travel, for example, travel to Bangladesh or Pakistan to buy a kidney, for example. But there are other flows as well, and we can talk about it. There's a lot of different players in this industry, again, more on the legal side than on the illegal side. But there are a number of players here, each of whom have their own roles and responsibilities, and some of which are doing great things for the world. Others are not so much. And I got to say, especially in the realm of facilitators, there's a real division. Everything from a large multinational corporation who's experienced and insured to and this is a real person that I met, a travel agent in Florida who had a couple slow years and decided a great way to get new clients would be to start a medical tourism facilitation business where they shepherd and they matchmake. Some of these people get paid kickbacks, or as they might say it, referral fees, by hospitals, and they don't necessarily always disclose that to a patient who's choosing this, and we can talk all about that. But now I want to zone in onto two topics. One will be transplant tourism, and then we'll talk about circumvention tourism more generally. So let me introduce transplant tourism by way of a case study, which is a composite of several real cases. And this, by the way, is what it looks like to take out a kidney. And these are some of the men who sell it. Not my images, they're borrowed images, but these are real images of people who've undergone nephrectomy in Bangladesh. So Akash is a 24-year-old man living in Dhaka, which is the capital of Bangladesh. He sees an advertisement in the Daily Ittifaq, the local newspaper, which reads, "Request for kidney donation. Both kidneys of a U.S. resident are damaged. Kidney specialists advise her to transplant a kidney immediately. A heartfelt request is made to the good persons who can donate a kidney with the following criteria. The interested donor's blood group and tissue must be matched with those of the person, blood group O+. The donor, male or female, must travel to the donation. The transplant will be performed at a U.S. University medical center. Donor must be in good health, between 19 and 40 years of age. All the relevant expenses will be covered. To discuss details, contact urgently the following address," and there's an address there. So this is a real ad. I didn't make this one up, right? Our hypothetical person, Akash, contacts the number and meets a broker who tells him he wants him to participate in the noble act of kidney donation and promises to cover all expenses and compensate him well. Akash is told that the operation is completely safe, that it will be in the hands of a world-renowned specialist, and Akash is also told the myth of the sleeping kidney, which is a real thing that's really circulating in these circles in Bangladesh, where selling a kidney is presented as a win-win situation in which by removing one kidney, the transplant surgeon awakens the other sleeping kidney through medication, and the seller is portrayed as living perfectly well with only the one remaining kidney. The broker tells Akash he might even get a job or a visa out of the transplant. The broker tells him that going abroad for transplantation to India, not exactly what was advertised in the ad, often it's a story that's told, and when you come in, you get a slightly different story, will be fun. He can eat out, shop, watch Bollywood movies. Offers Akash 100,000 taka, roughly $1,400 US, and tells him he will not receive the entire amount until just before entering the operation room for fear that he might renege. The broker arranges a fake passport, forged legal documents for Akash that indicate he's donating a kidney to a relative, and advises Akash to hide his identity so the Indian healthcare personnel do not reject his case. After crossing the Indian border, the broker seizes his passport to ensure that he cannot return to Bangladesh before the kidney is removed. He's housed in poor accommodations, rooming with as many as 10 other sellers in a bachelor apartment rented by the broker. Medical tests are redone because they do not trust the Bangladeshi results. The day before the operation, he asks for his promised money, but is now told he will not be paid until he returns to Bangladesh. After the surgery, he notices a 20-inch nephrectomy scar. You can see that over there. Had this been done in the United States, you would have a 3-inch scar. And it would cost $200 more to actually do this laparoscopically and have a 3 or 4-inch scar. He's released from the hospital 5 days in a less than hygienic apartment. He's returned to Bangladesh with a few days later, despite the doctor's orders to rest in India. Along the train route, his wounds bleed a little bit. Upon return, he experiences a decline in his health, psychological suffering, and begins to refer to himself as handicapped. He experiences pain, weakness, weight loss, frequent illness. He also has to confront the stigma of his 20-inch scar. People refer to him as a kidney man and he tries to hide it or make up stories about an accident. The scar also interferes with his eligibility for marriage. He refers to the day of transplant as his death day. While selling a kidney is typically illegal in all of these places, everywhere in the world except Iran, it's illegal to sell a kidney. In Iran, they have a mixed system. You can sell it to the government, but the government then distributes it. These laws are not often fully enforced, and there's a real opening for a black market. Should home countries like Canada seek to criminalize the activities of their patients going abroad to buy a kidney? Should those patients be denied reimbursement for immunosuppressive drugs as a deterrent, or is that too much of a draconian solution? Would a regulated kidney market be better than a through and through prohibition? What kinds of domestic, international, hard and soft law might we use to tackle the problem? So that's what the first part of this talk is going to be about. So first, let me show you some data about kidney sellers. The word donation is sometimes used here, but it's a misnomer. These are people selling it. And by the way, this is the PSA moment. Let me tell you that a big reason why this market exists is because there's a shortage of kidney donors in a place like Canada or the United States. But actually, in Canada and the US, kidney donation is very safe. There's almost no difference in morbidity or mortality between people who donate a kidney and people who don't donate a kidney, right? Life expectancy is basically the same. But that's not necessarily true of these places. So I'm going to show you some data, mostly from Pakistan and Bangladesh. I've got some slides on India, but I probably won't belabor them. In Pakistan, there is, by estimates, over 2,000 kidneys sold per year, with about 2/3 going to foreigners. Naqvi et al. Did an interview study with 239 sellers. The data that you can see show that sellers are largely poor, illiterate, lots of dependents, saddled with debt, and promised a mean of about $1,700 US for kidneys, but actually paid about $1,377, and that's pretty typical. People actually don't get paid the full amount that they're promised. All sellers indicated that their health was good before the transplant, but only 1.2% said their health was as good after it. 62% said that they felt physically weak, unable to work the long hours they did before the transplant, and 36.8% said their health was poor and they felt ill, suggesting they had to stop working for periods of time. When it came to finances, 85% said there was no improvement in their lives, and they were either still in debt or had not achieved their objectives. The most common objectives and reason they give: help a loved one, buy oneself out of bonded labor, afford a bride price, or buy a market stall. That's typical of these stories. Here's another set of data from Bangladesh. Moniruzzaman did an ethnography of 33 sellers, a relatively small N study. I told you a little bit about the myth of the sleeping kidney. Very often comes back. Also often they're offered jobs, visa, citizenship to live abroad, and land. Offered about $1,150 US or 80,000 taka for the kidney, and told the number is low because of their blood type. Actually paid a little bit less in the end of the day. After crossing to India for the actual surgery, patients are housed in squalid conditions. Those who want to renege are denied access to their passports, or sometimes threatened by mustans, essentially local thugs, to beat them up. After the surgery, paid less than promised, traveled back to Bangladesh with scars. And the photo I showed you again before was from Bangladeshi man. Male sellers still refer to themselves as kidney men, socially isolated, referring to their death day. Moniruzzaman finds that sellers' self-reported health, and that's important, and the follow-up time is short, usually 6 months to a year and a half in these studies, but their self-reported health, significant declines. And many of them, the rate of regret is upward, usually of 80% in these studies, and when they're asked if they would do it again. There's some similar data from India. We can come back if you want to talk about India specifically, but the story is relatively similar. What about the people who go from places like Canada and the United States? Let me show you two studies. One is a study from UCLA, the Gill et al. Study, looked at 33 recipients who had gone abroad for kidney transplants, kidney tourists. Mostly found they were going to their country of origin, ethnically speaking. Had a higher cumulative incidence of acute rejection in the first year after transplant, 30% rejection versus 12% kidney rejection. There were no overall differences in the incidence of infections in the tourists versus matched cohort, but the infections the tourist patients had were much more severe, much more likely to have the tourists be hospitalized, and their range of days of hospitalization was between 1 to 744 days in the hospital. Another study from Minnesota, Canales et al., found that graft and patient survival were comparable to results obtained in the United States, but inadequate communication between the transplant unit and their institution relating to vital information on induction therapy, immunosuppressive post-transplant course of treatment. In 3 cases, the patients were sent back to the United States in the midst of a crisis relating to wound infection, seizure, and acute rejection. Third study here in Canada, Prasad et al. At St. Mike's. 20 Canadian transplant tourists, all but 3 went to their country of origin for transplant. Their 36-month grant survival rate was much worse compared to the biologically related and emotionally related transplant groups they compared them to. 52% of the patients in the transplant tourist group had serious post-transplant infections and were considered opportunistic, and 2 of these died due to fungal-related sepsis. While transplant patients were on the same immunosuppressive drugs as Canadian patients, the higher rate of infection was ascribed to poor immunosuppression monitoring, post-transplant hygiene, or delayed recognition. Surgical complications were also frequent at initial presentation. Now, if I stop the presentation right now and asked you, what's the next slide going to be? I tell you the next slide is about what we should do, right? And the normative evaluation of this. I would bet dollars to donuts that you think the next slide is going to be, this is an incredibly terrible trade. I can't imagine anything worse. We should intervene to stop it. But, I'm partially trained in philosophy, and a lawyer as well. So my answer is, it's actually more complicated than that. So these are the typical kinds of arguments that are offered as to why transplant tourism is wrong. And we can discuss them more in Q&A. But what I'll say is that in my own view, the first 4, which are probably the most commonly made in the literature, especially colloquially, they all run into problems. especially when you are not going to be committed to improving the lives of these people. That it in some ways does a double harm to them to say, you're so poor and desperate, I'm not going to let you engage in this practice, and then say, and I'm going to block the exchange and leave you as poor and desperate as you were before I met you, and block this one option. So in my view, the better and the strongest argument for regulating this trade actually comes from a realm of consent and paternalism. Lack of informed consent, people don't understand what the consequences are. Questions about how well they comprehend what's going on, lies, pressure, and the like. And in my ideal world, I would regulate that away, right? If I were running a regulated kidney market, I think it might be possible to deal with these objections to kidney transplant than to a market of kidney transplant. But my own conclusion is that when it comes to this black market and the international trade, we just can't do that. So my own view is that the argument for prohibition is not a first-order easy argument, but is instead an argument from the second best. My first best world might be a heavily regulated market for kidneys, but that's just impossible to achieve when it comes to transplant tourism. So the next best alternative is to actually prohibit it. Well, imagine you think we should, so these are the slides on this. We can come back to this if you want to talk. If it was a crowd of philosophers, I'd spend most of the talk on this. But you're a mixed crowd, so I'm trying to mix it up a little bit. So imagine, though, you were convinced that actually this is a trade we want to deter and we want to stop. What might we do as a regulator? What are the kinds of things available to us? Dramatic water pause. One possibility is destination country enforcement. Good to have destination countries enforce their laws, but insufficient. Already illegal in most of the places where people are going. Has been weak thus far to actually enforce Indian or Pakistani or Bangladeshi laws. Although the US recently had a high-profile case it prosecuted involving someone from Brooklyn, I think he was a rabbi actually, selling organs to Israelis. Another possibility is professional self-regulation. The Declaration of Istanbul, which is a declaration nephrologists have done, and the, I think, World Association and many associations of nephrology have signed on to, has been helpful, but it's soft law. It's prompted some legislative changes in some countries, but often the legislation changes, but the practice doesn't. There also have been some defectors in terms of countries that have not gone ahead and done this. And there's concern that they failed to do this in some states because they believe that while they may have stimulated the states with vulnerable populations to take actions to protect their citizens from groups they prey on, the poor to secure organs, the better off states continue to face chronic and serious imbalances between seriously insufficient local supplies and expanding demands from an aging population. And the failure to develop a strong anti-trafficking program in the Western, well-developed countries continues to stimulate this market. Another possibility is home country extraterritorial criminalization. NOTA, which is the US law, the National Organ Transplant Act, bans buying or selling a kidney in the US, but it's silent about what happens outside of the United States. Don't know the exact law in Canada, but I suspect it's the same way. These laws don't have extraterritorial application. You could make it a crime in Canada, a crime under the Canadian Criminal Code, to buy an organ anywhere in the world, right? But we haven't gone ahead and done that. International criminal law would be nice if you could do it, but probably very unlikely. What about the fact that the Canadian healthcare system and private insurers in the United States pay for the immunosuppressive drugs of the people who go abroad and buy kidneys illegally and engage in what many consider to be a human rights violation? These drugs cost about $15,000 to $20,000 per year. You could have the provincial payer refuse to cover it unless you can prove that yours was not a kidney that was bought illegally, right? Now, the bad side of that, it would have a very deep socioeconomic status effect, in that wealthy people could probably still self-pay for the immunosuppressive drugs. So maybe you'd want to try to prevent that as well. And when I tell physicians about this idea, they look at me aghast in horror, right? Here is somebody who you're basically going to put them in a situation where their body is going to reject the organ, right? This is the exact thing we try to prevent. But I will say that I think there might be some moral arguments. Just as when someone steals and robs from a bank, you don't let them keep the ill-gotten gains, right? You might say that what this person has done is stolen a kidney in a way that is illegal from our perspective, and why should they be able to keep the kidney. I will say that there's an interesting twist here, which is that the cost of dialysis far outstrips the cost of immunosuppressive drugs year by year. So all payers actually benefit from this. They would much rather, from a bottom line economics perspective, not saying this is their actual motivation, but if you look at it just as an economic matter, they'd rather hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, and let people go get organs, because the alternative is that they would have to pay for dialysis, which is much more expensive. So we have to think a little bit about this. And then I think perhaps the most tangible things that you and I can do is to try to help improve organ procurement and recovery in the countries. Because essentially, why this market exists is, one, increase in availability in things like cyclosporin that allows you to use a broader range of organs in terms of rejection. And two, increased demand as our population gets older and therefore survives longer, and organ donation rates stay relatively the same. So this is important. It's easy to say, and we can have discussions about opt-in versus opt-out, and whether that really makes the difference or whether it's about the culture of talking to patients and the like. But my own conception is that if you really care about this particular trade and you really want to end it, you have to do some combination of these. None of these is a magic bullet. Okay. Second part of the talk, circumvention tourism. Let me give you a few case studies of how this works. Susan. Susan's a 50-year-old woman diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease, typically results in death within 3 years of diagnosis due to the wasting of respiratory muscles. Before death ensues, patients with the disease face difficulty with speech, chewing, swallowing. Susan is unable to end her own life because assisted suicide is illegal in her home state of Connecticut. Her brother, John, helps her travel to Switzerland, to Zurich, where a clinic there, Dignitas, assists her in ending her life. When her brother returns to Connecticut, should he face prosecution? Should the state be able to prosecute him for doing so? What are the concerns here? Second case study, Andrea. Andrea is a 21-year-old Irish woman experiencing an unwanted pregnancy. Abortion is illegal for her in Ireland. She therefore travels by boat to Women on Waves, which is a floating abortion clinic anchored in international waters off the coast of Ireland. Ships in international waters are governed by the law of the country whose flag they fly, who chartered them, and this one is chartered under the Netherlands, where abortion is legal. Nevertheless, when she returns to Dublin, should the Irish government be allowed to prosecute her if it wants to? Can it do so? What do we think about this? Third example, Jason and his partner Jonathan are frustrated by the difficulty of securing a surrogate in their home country of Canada, say they're from here in Vancouver, where paid surrogacy is largely unavailable. They turn to a clinic in the village of Anand in India where the practice is legal. And this, by the way, are photos from Anand. This is, I think, Dr. Patel over here and a happy couple who use the services. This is a typical room where the surrogates live in Anand. And the question is, how should Canada react to this? When they come home, should Canada criminalize what they've done and try to prosecute them? Should Canada recognize the citizenship and the parenthood of the children they produce? Last example, Nawal. Nawal is a 2-year-old U.S. citizen whose parents, both now U.S. citizens, emigrated from Sudan 20 years earlier and gave up their Sudanese citizenship. The family now lives in a largely Sudanese-American community in Baltimore, Maryland. Nawal's grandparents have pressured her parents to have female genital cutting performed on Nawal. Performing the procedure is illegal in the U.S., so Nawal's parents take her to the Sudan, where a local doctor performs the surgery. Could the United States prosecute these people? Should the United States prosecute these people? And most importantly, how does your answer to these questions relate to one another? So let's talk about that briefly. So first, let me just tell you a little bit about the existing practice on some of these things. Start by talking about assisted suicide. Switzerland is the most common destination for this because the canton of Zurich is the one place in the world where it's available and there's no residency requirement. So as a non-Swiss citizen, you can go to Zurich to end your life. The UK has actually had a series of cases on this subject about whether the UK can prosecute a family member by taking someone abroad. And they've culminated in basically the directors of public prosecution giving a list of factors that will make it more likely they'll prosecute you and less likely that they'll prosecute you. But there continues to be litigation on the subject before the European Court of Human Rights. Abortion. So West Germany, before reunification, had something known as Paragraph 218 of the Criminal Code, made abortion a criminal offense unless the mother's health was in danger. It also extended extraterritorially, so if you went outside of West Germany, same prohibition. And actually, there were cases of custom officials searching the cars of women who came back from West Germany to look for abortion paraphernalia or something else that indicated, including vaginal searches, believe it or not, in some of these cases historically. Ireland continues to struggle with this. It had some litigation over what's known as the X case involving life of the mother or distress to the mother exception. Ultimately, out of fear that the European Court of Human Rights would interfere and basically declare that they'd acted against the European law, they passed the Travel Amendment, which says that the article that prohibits abortion shall not limit freedom to travel between the state and another state. But this continues to be a difficult question in Ireland and lots of restrictions, including on the speech. Reproductive technology. Many countries, or their states or province, limit or ban certain assisted reproductive technologies. For example, bans on commercial surrogacy, egg sale, sperm donor anonymity, access restrictions to people who are married, to people who are straight, to people who are younger. And these are frequently circumvented. And the place where most people go, or many people go at least, is California, actually, the U.S. state of California, where surrogacy agreements are often honored. But also, there's a huge amount of importation of sperm, for example, in countries that have prohibitions on sperm donor anonymity. What people have often done is actually imported sperm from places where you're allowed to make it illegal. And we can talk more about that. Female genital cutting, I told you a little bit about this. It turns out that there is a statute in the U.S. that makes it illegal to engage in this practice for someone under the age of 18, but it has no extraterritorial application. The UK version, and I believe the Canadian version of the same legislation, does apply extraterritorially. So if you go to Sudan, you can be prosecuted, at least in the UK, I know for sure, and I believe in Canada as well. So there's both a doctrinal question and a normative question, and these, I think, are my two last slides. Yeah. So getting to the end. Sorry if I've droned on a little bit. Doctrinal question about international law. Can a country criminalize the activity of its citizen outside of the state? The answer under international law is very likely yes. There's a series of what are called bases in prescriptive jurisdiction. That is your ability to prescribe to make something illegal, to make an offense in the home country, to do something outside of it. Two that are particularly relevant here. One is the national or nationality principle. A state can assert jurisdiction over the acts of its citizen, even if it happens on foreign soil. The other, which is more controversial, is called passive personality. And essentially, this is when you assert jurisdiction when one of your citizens has been injured on foreign soil. Most cases of medical tourism will fall into the first category, the easy category, nationality. And although there is a balancing test in international law, which you can read the restatement section 403, foreign relations, if you're interested. You know, sometimes I know you're up late at night, you need something to put you to sleep. This could be a good thing to read, right? Or maybe one of my books, or no, just teasing. In any event, although there is this thing out there that has a balancing test, the analysis that I've offered in my work suggests it's not going to get in the way. Domestic law may have its own limits. So U.S. constitutional law, for example, or Canadian constitutional law may restrict this. But as a matter of international law, you may extend your jurisdiction to cases of people doing medical tourism, but you're not required to do so. Well, that puts us in the question of what you should do normatively. You have this discretion. How should you exercise it? So I spent a lot of time, again, if this is a philosopher's audience, I'd spend maybe an hour just on this slide, but I'm going to try to give you the short version, or shorter, I should say, a version. So let's bracket for the current purposes the big question of whether a domestic prohibition at home is justified or not. For example, whether we should prohibit abortion. It's a very interesting question, but it's not really a question about medical tourism. It's a question for general bioethics. What I'm interested in is the following question. Conditional on banning one of these things at home, so you believe it should be banned in Canada, should you, if you've criminalized the conduct at home, extend that criminalization to the activities of people abroad? Do you have a moral right to do so? Do you have a moral obligation to do so? That's the question I'm most interested to talk about now. So when you try to decide what you should do here, you first need to have a very thick conception of citizenship. And whether either on social contractarian or communitarian theory of the state's power to punish through the criminal law, does the territorial location of the conduct really matter? One way of putting the point is whether we think the sovereignty of the home country and its power to make people answer for crimes through criminal law, is it based on territoriality, the fact that you are in my territory at this particular moment of transgression, or is it about citizenship, the ties of being a citizen of the home country wherever you might be, or both? The more you think citizenship is a justifiable basis for the sovereign's ability to punish, the more you think that actually extraterritorial application to circumvention tourism makes sense. The more the home country will face significant externalized costs from the activity. So for example, in the case of reproductive technology, if you have individuals engaging in multiple embryo transfer and coming back and having children and having births that have very high neonatology costs that are imposed on the provincial payer, the more justified is the state in imposing its law, its criminal prohibition, extraterritorially to try to deter that conduct. On the other side of the ledger, though, you have to think a little bit about the way in which the destination country might have an interest in enabling this kind of circumvention tourism. And this is why, with the title of the talk, I tried to push this to you, the idea of outlaws or refugees, right? Is you view yourself as being a place of refuge for women who need abortions that are denied it in their home country? Or is it that you view these women as outlaws trying to skirt a law and go abroad, more like pirates, right? That is the Janus-like perspective on this. Which of the two it is? The more you think that the destination country has a legitimate interest in offering the service and making it freely available because it's deeply embedded in the culture, the more you want to basically allow it to do so, unhampered by the extraterritorial application of law. You also have to think a little bit about exit and accommodation and the cost of exit. You can think of circumvention tourism, leaving your home country to get a service like this, as kind of being a political theoretical midpoint between, on the one hand, exit and voice, right? You can either vote, you lose the vote in your election, that's voice. Exit, you renounce your citizenship. This is kind of in the middle, what I sometimes think of as exit light, where you leave your jurisdiction temporarily by going somewhere else, but you intend to come back. You don't completely renounce it. Guido Pennings has been the most staunch proponent of an approach to abortion and assisted suicide that says we ought to respect it because this decision of people to travel abroad, and we ought to protect it because a certain norm is applicable and applied in society as wanted by the majority, while simultaneously the members of the minority can still act according to their moral view by going abroad. And allowing people to look abroad demonstrates the absolute minimum of respect for their moral autonomy. And circumvention tourism becomes a kind of modus vivendi, preventing a frontal clash of opinions which may jeopardize social peace. So this is a kind of accommodation. To view travel abroad as a kind of accommodation. But I've argued in my work that this sounds very nice, but when you scratch the surface, it runs into some problems. First, it results in a kind of masking, where what some might think of as an instance of murder or child abuse, if you believe abortion is murder, if you believe FGC is a form of child abuse, it's happening, but we merely have it happen outside of our view by letting people go abroad. And again, I'm not saying I believe abortion is murder, but from someone who believes that that is the case, why would you possibly allow it to happen outside of your purview and say, that's fine, that's a ducky, right? You might also think it seems to be distributed in a morally arbitrary way, in that it tracks whether an individual has the finances to go abroad and the savvy to do so and to travel abroad. And you might say that if you really believe in this idea of accommodation, and this is a philosopher's point, what we really should do is instead have a lottery where we lottery off the same number of permits and make it available to everybody. So if you think abortion extraterritorially is not a problem, figure out how many of those are happening and instead have a lottery for permits to engage in abortion in the home country, because that would be a more distributively just way of distributing the option of traveling abroad. Now, if I said that to you, if I went on the floor of Parliament or in Ireland and proposed that, you would think I was crazy, right? You would think I was mad. But the question is, if we're achieving the same thing through travel, what is the morally significant difference between this? Finally, when your interest is preventing serious bodily harm, especially to a vulnerable entity, you might think that actually, and in a case where the victim and the citizen have the same citizenship, so the perpetrator and the victim are both citizens of the home country, you might think the state's interest in preventing serious bodily harm is at its zenith. So this suggests that actually not all cases of medical tourism are the same. We have to think about the kinds of harm involved. When the justification for criminalizing at home is something like preventing serious bodily harm to a vulnerable entity, you might think the home country's interest in prohibiting the same act extraterritorially for its citizens is at its zenith. When it's something more like the idea of corruption, that women's sexuality or the value of childbearing or something like that will be corrupted, attitude change, a kind of moralistic idea, here you might think it might depend on whether actually people doing it abroad ends up changing our views of the activity or of the good at home. Is there a semantic contagion or not? When you think it's a question of exploitation, here I think it's the most difficult set of questions. So for example, many people oppose paid surrogacy on the ground that it's exploitative of Canadian women. The question is it different if the people being exploited are Indian women? In what way is it different? First of all, you might say that seems worse. In Canada, at least, we are, a place where, especially post-Justin Trudeau, right, Canadian women are being heard and represented in the government in a way that seems quite important and quite respectful. That may not be true in all the places where circumvention tourism takes place. So you might say their exploitation is even worse because it's a silent exploitation. On the other hand, do we have the right to impose our view that X activity is exploitative on a country that might have different social norms? Is the Canadian government's right to legislate its conception of what constitutes exploitation as strong when you're talking about exploitation of Indian women as it is exploitation of Canadian women? Is there room for moral norms here, or does this depend to some extent on conceptions of global justice? If you think exploitation is about distributive justice, about who gets their share of the pie, it may be that as Canadians, our relationship to Indian folks in terms of exploitation and distribution is quite different than our relationship to our co-citizens, right? So these are very big and complicated questions of political theory. What I want you to leave you with, though, is that the question of whether we should use the power in international law to extend our criminal law extraterritorially for cases of medical tourism probably does not admit to a one-size-fits-all answer. It seems most appropriate in cases involving serious bodily harm. And the other cases, I think, depend on a lot more political theoretical work as well as empirical work of what's likely to happen. So just to finish up, medical tourism is exciting, it's important, has a lot of promise to improve the lives of patients. But you can see from the stories of people like Akash, it also has a very dark side. There are major challenges not only in regulating it, but also at the normative level in deciding what kind of regulation would be desirable. There are also kinds of circumvention tourism we really haven't talked about tonight, like travel abroad for stem cell therapies, and in particular parents taking their children for experimental stem cell therapies, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. And although this talk is focused on the second part of the book, circumvention tourism, I also want to emphasize that even the legal side of this industry raises significant ethical and legal questions. Questions about malpractice and when you can recover. Questions about the effects on the destination country and what happens if you cause migration from their public sector to the private sector or reinvestment in the private medical tourism business. What happens when people's healthcare options shrink because you've established a medical tourism center there. Happy to talk about any and all of this during the Q&A, but I promised Jeremy 45 minutes, and I think I'm right on time, right?
On the dot.
On the dot. Thank you very much.
So we do have about half an hour for Q&A. We're privileged to be in a very very high-tech room here. So if you'll see below you, there'll be a button to speak for your microphone. So I'll call on individuals, but if you can just hit the button when you're asking a question, we'll all be able to hear you. I think we have the option to vote too, so maybe we can all vote on each of these issues, and we'll just hash it all out tonight. So
perfect.
Yeah, but just.
Hi there. the interesting thing is when you consider a country like the United States with state governments being able to control laws to a much higher degree than, for example, provinces in Canada, that's this question of whether a state, like a country, can apply their laws extraterritorially becomes infinitely more complicated, I think, maybe, in a country like the United States, because California law is different from Texas law, is different from New Hampshire law. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so in the U.S., so the federal government has always been thought of as the main place for foreign relations and national security. And there have been cases where individual states have tried to do things. Actually, there's a case involving like insurance and the Holocaust in California, for example. And the courts have, when the U.S. government decides to act in the sphere of foreign relations, usually the courts defer to what the U.S. government has done, the federal government, and preempt what the states have done. But it has to act. When there's a vacuum, it's a harder thing to say. So, for example, on the legal side of it, California has authorized a certain amount of medical tourism to Mexico and has a whole system in place. Texas has made it illegal or has prohibited, if you're not a self-insured firm, if you're a regular insurance firm, they basically won't allow regular insurers in Texas to pay for medical tourism. Now, the federal government could probably step in and prohibit that, because when you're talking about crossing borders, that's where the federal government's power has lied. But for the most part, the federal government hasn't, and you're talking about a vacuum. But I will also say that there's some motion. So Justice Brandeis famously described the states as the laboratory of democratic experimentation, this idea that we have 50-some laboratories going on at one time, and this will guide us, and this is this wonderful thing that experimentation will ultimately bubble up and will have an answer to the federal government. In reality, it very rarely works that way. We are seeing some experimentation on marijuana right now with legalization, assisted suicide, gay marriage. We had some experimentation for a while until the Supreme Court intervened. Chances are, I think, in most healthcare matters, at least traditionally, there's a lot of state experimentation, but not actually that grand moment where the feds say, we've seen the data, we know what the right answer is, let's go. And that may have something more to do with the actual just current setup of the U.S. system. And some people often say it's separation of parties, not powers. The idea that actually the Republican Party at the federal and state level is much closer together than is the Republican Party at the federal level and the Democratic Party at the federal level. No questions at all? He's directing the queue.
Just back to, I may be mistaken here, but back to your presentation of 5 main arguments against kidney sales.
Yes, absolutely. Let's talk about those. Yeah.
Yeah. The first 4, I believe, you kind of waved the wand at a little bit, and then the last one, consent paternalism. So I promise I'll read the book as well. I'm sure it's in there. But would you be able to expand a little bit on maybe how that final one could be used to control this issue or as a possible solution?
Yeah, absolutely. So it might be helpful just to say a little bit more of these argument types and just to distinguish them, right? Because I think actually in common parlance for non-philosophers, people first of all use the term commodification to mean all of these things. And even then, the borders between these are a little distinct. So what are the arguments? Corruption is the idea that there's a norm violation going on. Allowing me to sell my kidney and allowing you to buy it does violence to the way we think the good is properly valued. And either it's a consequentialist story about attitudes actually changing, or it's a story about intrinsic wrongs being done by this. Crowding out is the idea that the total number of kidneys, or the total number donated at least, will go down. Motivational crowding out. When you allow something to be sold, people will stop giving it away for free, right? Coercion is the idea that someone is forced into doing something either by gun to the head, which I think everybody agrees is wrong, or more subtly by some notion of their poverty. They have no alternative but to do this. And exploitation, which is close but actually distinct from coercion, is the idea that somebody has been exploited, right? And that usually has to do with the price term. We can talk about how philosophers distinguish these two. But one way of thinking about it is if you say A exploits B from this particular sale, there exists in your back of your mind a hypothetical price for the exchange where the exchange would not be exploitative, but it might still be coercive. Okay, so having gone through that relatively quickly, and I'm happy to go back, right? Let's talk about consent and paternalism, at least briefly. So when you talk about consent and paternalism, first you're talking about voluntariness. Voluntariness, in the case of gun to the head, not met, not done under threat of force. But most of these cases we're talking about, Akasha's case, is at least voluntary in the most basic sense of the word. He is deciding to participate and to engage in this transaction. Maybe he has no good other options, but he at least is making this decision and taking this action. Is it informed? Well, most of the sellers of kidney are misinformed about the risks of this donation. They're told it's 100% safe when it's not. They're misinformed about the quality of the doctors performing the surgery. They're falsely assured about the myth of the sleeping kidney, the promise of citizenship, the pleasantness of the condition, the likelihood that they will be okay after the transplant. So I would say that's a big problem. It's not informed. And then you have to talk a little bit about capacity to consent. Now here I get a little more wobbly. I don't want to say lack of education or illiteracy is a per se defeats the ability to give informed consent. If I said that, then I think we would infantilize a large swath of the world's population and say they can't do that. Instead, if there's a problem here, it has much more to do with bounded rationality. So the studies show upwards of 85% consistently have ex post regret. These people regret what they did a year and a half. Now, the reason why they regret it is actually complicated, and we don't actually have a lot of great data. Many of the cases will just be things that didn't work out like they thought. They thought the money would buy them out of bonded labor. It wasn't enough. They thought it would get them be able to pay a dowry. It turned out that didn't happen. The woman they wanted to marry had married someone else by that time. In other cases, it may be that their health state is much worse than they thought, so they got what they thought they were going to get, but the negative side of it has gone dramatically down. When you see a problem about bounded rationality, people making decisions that don't serve their own interests due to cognitive deficits, my first instinct is, like my colleague Cass Sunstein, is let's have an intervention that's a nudge, libertarian paternalist. We don't want to break out the ruler and slap people on the wrist and say, no, prohibited, if you can do something more subtle. And when we come to the question of an organ market in the United States or Canada, I think better informed consent, waiting periods, right? Pre-screening and psychological screening of individuals, right? Perhaps some regulation of the price, either a price ceiling or a price floor. These are all viable regulatory strategies in a well-developed regulatory system. When you're talking about a system of people in the dark, essentially, going abroad and being coordinated by a low-level mafia and having to coordinate 3 different countries in their jurisprudence, I'm just skeptical when it comes to transplant tourism. So I'm a little bit of an odd duck in this debate in that I've written stuff against transplant tourism, and at the same time I've written stuff that says it's worthwhile to consider regulated organ markets in a place like the United States and Canada. But this comes to me mostly from a place of having strong doubts about the ability to actually impose regulation on this market. But there's people who are more libertarian than I am who actually say the reason why there's no regulation here is because you've created a black market. If we had a market that was more open and more regulated, it might be able to do that.
Thanks. So thanks for that talk, Glenn. It was really interesting. It was a nice digest version of your book. So
or half of it, at least.
I can stop having it on my I can stop reading it on my bedside table each night. So I wasn't surprised when you sort of suggested that a focus on potentially denying insurance coverage for immunosuppressive drugs, either through public or private insurance, would be one possible way to help sort of stem the flow of people illegally obtaining organs abroad. In the kind of work that Jeremy and I do, or at least that I do, and maybe could speak for Jeremy, we do a lot of sort of on-the-ground empirical work. And one thing I find about a lot of the high-level theoretical arguments about regulation in the medical tourism industry or sector is that they actually fall apart once you actually think about on the ground who would be involved in undertaking that. So aside from that, because I think that's where that argument could sort of start to fall apart, I was just wondering, I imagine these are the kinds of discussions legal scholars have, is if you think about moving forward in that direction, would you then advocate for denying medical coverage for all people involved in illegal activities that resulted in them requiring lifelong pharmaceuticals. Let's
Yeah.
even just keep it at pharmaceuticals. Would you see that as opening it up, or would a legal scholar be able to sort of tease that apart from other parallels?
So great question. And again, in the book and in the paper, I float this as an idea mostly to provoke people, right? I think it's just dead on arrival in terms of people being willing to do this. But there's an interesting question here. So just to restate Valerie's question slightly differently, right? Your argument about denying people who've bought organs immunosuppressive drugs seems to lead to a slippery slope or have the implication that we should deny medical treatment for all criminals because they too have violated the law. Isn't that right, Professor Cohen, right? That would be the harsh way of putting it.
So I just want to, so what I did was I took your bait. You
Exactly.
were looking for this question.
No, I don't know. But I've thought about this question
Okay.
at least, right? So here's one thing I would say, is that the nexus seems much tighter between the illegal activity and the thing that we want to take away from you, right? So it's not that we want to deny you whole hog health care, right? And, you could have a view that would be a very strong deterrent, but you might say, if you're a retributivist, right? So you think you punish people because they deserve to be punished. There's a conception of desert at the heart of why you think criminal punishment is justified. You want the punishment to be well suited to the activity. And all I'm talking about is a kind of disgorgement remedy, right? Just as when you steal the bank or steal the painting or something like that, we make you give that back. In fact, we make you do more than that. We make you spend some time in jail. But we don't, in most countries, actually treat this as an offense that costs you your life, right? So for me, there's a question not only of proportionality, the amount of punishment, but a question of the nexus, right? Is the kind of thing we're making you give back something that's in the sphere of what your transgression was or not? So I tend to think about this more like not punishment for the sake of punishment, but making you return, in a sense, that which you obfuscated. Now, it's not quite the same, because it's not as though at that point you can return the kidney, right, to the person you took it from. So it's not like giving the money back to your victim or a kind of restitution. But to me, that makes it look somewhat different than an attempt just to punish someone by denying them health care, right? Now, you might worry, and again, I defer to the doctors here, about whether in some proportion of cases, if you denied immunosuppressive drugs and you had to remove the organ, the person might end up not merely as badly off as they were before transplant, but considerably worse off, and whether that ends up looking in some subset of cases more like a death sentence. But I do think there's a principled distinction between this. And another way of putting it is to flip the idea and to say, you have no entitlement to ask the Canadian taxpayers to help you continue to profit of something you did that was illegal, right? So instead of saying this is a punishment, we're taking away something from you as a punishment, bad boy. Instead, one way of thinking about it is, do you have an entitlement to this particular kind of treatment? We have all sorts of reasons why we deny people entitlements to certain kinds of treatments, right? One of them could just be the provincial payers decided the quality adjusted life years for this is too high, or the benefit is too low for the individual. So if I ask you, should we pay for that immunosuppressive drug for this person as opposed to investing more in neonatology or investing more in influenza control, right? Then I think the question takes on a very different hue. And you might say, why should this person have this claim on the Canadian taxpayer to help them continue the criminal thing they did and to profit from it? So that's what I might say on that.
I'll jump in and I'll give you a chance a second. Okay. So again, just to echo the thanks for the really interesting talk. I was wondering just to put you on the spot a little bit, just to get a little bit more of what your particular view on this. So if this talk is going to be put online, so we can imagine Justin Trudeau is probably going to come across it. He's probably going to be super impressed and give you a call. So if that were the case, and said, we're going to pass a new law, and we're interested in, in the past, we've gone after people who have engaged in sex tourism with underage children, and so we want to potentially expand that out to some of these other areas, maybe surrogacy, more, maybe organ transplantation, some of the other ones. Are there a couple that you would again, this, if asked your advice, that you would suggest that we go after
Yeah.
that maybe less that it's legally, that it's just following that legal precedent, but morally speaking, that these are the ones we ought to be going after for Canadians who are engaging in. What would be those?
So I think the clearest one to me and the one that's closest, so again, most countries, including the United States, have a prohibition on not only engaging in sex with an underage person in Canada or in the U.S., but extraterritorially. So this is one of the places where we have made our law apply extraterritorially. I think the case that has the strong analogy to that is the case of female genital cutting. And to me, I think that the approach the UK has taken, and it may also be the Canadian approach, I know it's not the United States approach, is just, seems to me, all the same reasons why you want to prohibit this in Canada, you ought to also prohibit a family from taking their daughter abroad. So that one, to me, is the easy one. The next one, I think, is probably the transplant tourism. And again, I think actually there may be some reasons not to criminalize it if it was well regulated in a country like US and Canada. But once you've established that it ought to be criminally prohibited in your country, it seems to me if your goal is... Now, here one distinction is the victim of transplant tourism is not a Canadian citizen. It's a citizen of another country. So that's an extra step, I think, in the argument. But the kind of harm is serious bodily harm that we're talking about. If I was in a country where abortion was prohibited, I think that would be the next easiest, actually, before transplant tourism. Because I think of abortion and FGC and sex tourism as being very similar in that it's about harm to a vulnerable individual. But of course, in Canada, we don't have a prohibition on abortion, so it would not be a matter of doing that. But if I was talking to the Prime Minister of Poland or someone, I think President of Poland, I'm not sure, the highest official in Poland, for example, where they do have some restrictions, I would tell them that your restriction should mirror whatever you do domestically. But I do think that if you've decided, you signed the Declaration of Istanbul, we're all against transplant tourism, you really should have the further step of making it a crime in Canada to engage in transplant tourism in India and stuff like that. There would be some negative ramifications. One is that individuals who go and get transplanted and come back to Canada may be less likely to talk to their doctors to get good post-operative care. Doctors may be put in a situation where they might feel they have dual loyalties and there might be questions of duties to inform versus the like. But there are precedents for that in terms of the reporting of child abuse, reporting of some STIs, and the reporting of gunshot wounds in some parts, at least in the United States and I think in Canada as well. So to me, those would be the target ones to think about going next.
One that I noticed wasn't on your list was sort of mirroring an interesting case that we've had in Canada over the last year or so, which was a family who had a daughter who expressed a desire not to continue chemotherapy and was taken down to his Hippocrates clinic in Florida. I think it was made further complicated by the fact that it was an Aboriginal family, and so a lot of issues were involved. But it seems like that could potentially, because it's third-party harm, it's a child, the sort of thing that I would have thought might have been on your list.
Yeah, so I was thinking about the examples I talked about, but you're right. So I have another chapter of the book on stem cell therapies, and here it's not so much that it's illegal, but just the regulatory system doesn't make it available in Canada because actually 98% of the stem cell therapies being offered across the world right now have no good science to back them up, right? They're mostly, and some of them are dangerous. Now, in the United States and in Canada, we've had cases involving guardianship and medical guardianship where a form of child abuse, it's considered that if you basically you refuse to give your child a certain kind of treatment, that's the conventional treatment that cures something, and it's not for a religious reason. When it becomes for a religious reason, there's an extra complication. There have been declarations of medical guardianship, which is not to say the state takes the child away from you, but the state appoints a guardian for that child for medical decisions. And for me, that makes sense, and that's a kind of law that we have, although when it should be applied, and it depends a lot more on the particulars of cases than I think most of this does. In part because I think that there's probably a range of medical decisions that are unwise but not unreasonable or don't show you to be an unfit parent. Then beyond that, there's a range of further decisions that are clearly the act of an unfit parent unless motivated by a sincere religious belief. Then there's a subset that are the act of an unfit parent but motivated by a sincere religious belief. And I think that third category is the most complicated. in part because it's a question of honoring that. So for this one, Prime Minister Trudeau, since I know you're watching, Prime Minister Trudeau, I think it would be good to have some clarity on this, but my impression is that whatever you would do domestically for children who are choosing not to get treated domestically, you probably want the same rules to apply extraterritorially for that too.
So the transplant tourism that we were talking about here, where people are selling their organs, that applies to kidneys because you can live with one. But what kind of effect or what kind of prevalence is there on people that are selling the organs of, for example, a deceased loved one, like a heart, liver, lungs, anything like that? The surgeries are more technically challenging, so it doesn't. I would assume the facilities wouldn't be as common, but I wonder what the impact is.
So in the literature, there is some liver lobe tourism and the like. That's probably the next after kidney. I mean, depending on how you think of it, some people would treat semen and oocytes, eggs, as a form of transplant, right? Most of the statutes just differentiate them and don't treat them as transplants, but that's an extremely common form of transplant tourism, if you think about that. But in terms of solid organs, after kidneys, it's liver lobes, it's the next most. But I would say, at least from my understanding of the literature out there, dramatically less of those, in part because demand is less, and as you suggest, the technical sufficiency is higher. But my own view is whatever you do on kidneys, whatever your country does domestically on liver lobes, you should probably do the same extraterritorially as well.
Anyone else with any questions for Glenn?
Recently, womb or uterus transplantation has been in the news. I'd love to know what you think.
Yeah, so the first thing to say about it is I'm puzzled a little bit by it. I'm puzzled for the following reason. I'm puzzled by why there's a demand for it, right? So one of the reasons why it's been developed actually were in countries that had significant restrictions on surrogacy. So in some ways it was an alternative to surrogacy. And I understand if surrogacy is unavailable to you, I understand why you might want to try uterus transplantation. What I've been, and I really have been puzzling about this. I'm thinking about maybe writing something, but I haven't written it yet. What I'm puzzled about is the following question, right? What is the difference from you, if imagine surrogacy is available, as a consumer of this, it's your egg, you're the woman, it's your egg, and there's a man, his sperm, either way. Is it more your child if it's your egg and someone else's uterus implanted in you than it is your egg and same sperm implanted in a woman who has her uterus intact as a surrogate, right? It seems to me there must be some kind of magical thinking about the fact that this is me, that it came through my birth canal, that makes it me in a way that I find fascinating. And it reminds me actually of a famous, I don't know famous, but to me, maybe infamous case involving two brothers, one of whom was born with a functioning penis, but without testes, and the other one, they were identical twins, the other one, both parts were functioning. And you would think the solution to this was have the brother, they're identical twins, have the brother who's fertile and everything is working well give some semen and use that to inseminate the wife of the brother who is unable to do this. But no, instead what they did is they actually transplanted one testicle from one brother into the other brother so he could engage in the sex act, right? And again, to me, it's the same mystery that there's something cultural telling us that the two activities are different in a way that's meaningful. But I have to say, when I sit back and think about it, it seems like a lot of expense is being spent to get something very ineffable and intangible. So, my own view is in countries where surrogacy is widespread and available, I think there's a strong argument not for doing uterine transplants which have medical complications and the like. But in countries where it's not available, I see this as an alternative, but I'm not sure I see it as a better alternative. So if you made me czar and asked me, would you be more comfortable legalizing surrogacy and not having uterus transplants or having uterus transplants and keeping surrogacy criminalized, I'm not sure I would choose the uterus transplant route. But I haven't fully thought about this, nor have I read enough about the ethical discourse on it so far. But I think it's really interesting.
I was just wondering, because I know that this has been done in Switzerland using live donors, like living donors, but they're looking at doing it in the U.S. with donors who are deceased. And so I wonder if that makes it different because you don't have to involve another party and have that potential for exploitation.
Yeah.
And I do feel that some women would rather choose this because they want to have the experience of carrying.
Yeah. So I think it's less problematic when it's involving deceased women, but I think that's also true of organs, and yet we have a lot of prohibitions on the sale of cadaverous organs. Like, I could pay you now for your organs later, right? And we seem very uncomfortable with that. But I definitely think it's less of a problem when you're talking about cadaverous. I suspect, because this is true with organs, cadaverous organs are often less good in terms of life expectancy, likelihood of success than are live organs. And I don't know whether the same is true when it comes to uteruses. But I will say, so again, I'm not a big fan of arguments about creepiness and like the wisdom of repugnance, as Leon Kass puts it. But there is something really interesting in saying, I care about carrying a baby so much that I want a uterus that's been from somebody deceased, right, who died, transplanted into me. So a piece of a person's dead body transplanted into me. And I'm just fascinated by this desire because it strikes me, in some ways it's a very beautiful image, the idea of life coming out of death, quite literally here. But on the other hand, it strikes me as kind of fodder for many horror movies that will no likely come out later on.
We do have 1 or 2 minutes. I know dessert awaits, but I think we do have an opportunity for one last question if anyone has been waiting. Yep.
So just taking that kind of point further, maybe the idea of your child actually being biologically yours, why don't they just adopt?
Yeah, so I think this is so. And again, this is what's interesting, is that actually a lot of our thinking about paternity is culturally contingent. So there are, I think it's actually the Trobriand Islanders. I'd have to go back to look back to see which it is. But in one of these societies, there's actually a conception that the father's job is not to produce the child. The father's job is to open up the pathway, the vaginal pathway by which the mother's ancestor spirit, the Boloma, enters and impregnates the mother. And therefore, they're a matrilineal society, and the men are not considered to be the father of the child in a real way. So when you start reading anthropologically about other cultures and their conceptions about what it means to be related or to have a connection to one, suddenly you realize that our own conceptions of this are not inevitable, but they are themselves culturally contingent. And I'm reminded of Herodotus in the Histories, who has this great passage where he says, King Darius brings before him the Indians from the tribe Kalate, who eat their dead, and the Greeks who burn their dead. And he says to the Indians, how much would I have to pay you to burn your dead? And they say, do not speak of this, sir. Then he brings the Greeks who burn their dead, and he says, how much would I have to pay to you to instead eat your dead? They say, blasphemy, blasphemy, sir. And then Herodotus wittily replies at the end, culture is the king of all, right? But this notion that we can't escape these cultural constructs into which they're born, even as much as bioethicists and philosophers like to point out their irrationalities, they do have power over us.
I believe we did have one last question.
I thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I thought the looking at transplant and immunosuppressive drugs and so on interesting, but I'm wondering about the limitations. So in this case, you were talking about whether or not we're paying for immunosuppressive drugs, but sort of where do you put the limit? So is cancer secondary to the immunosuppressive therapies, yada, yada, graft-host disease, and, so on. And then I guess the other question that I have is that with something like a transplant where, in fact, you do need the immunosuppressive drugs and it's not particularly repugnant to most cultures that we're providing that. But what about stuff like the sexual reproductive things? So I've had women who have been over to India and, actually paying to have themselves impregnated and showing up, and they're in their 60s, and we're forced to be providing hormones and things like that. So.
Yeah. So one thing is to ask yourself, and this is more my lawyer's hat on, right? That, often deterrence is thought of to be a multiplication in the classical economic sense of the chance of detection as against the size of the penalty, right? So you might be that in a world where we announced and made it very public, no immunosuppressive drugs, no treatment at all for anybody who left Canada and did this, the number of people who actually called your bluff and did it would reduce dramatically. So you may actually be willing that even if it doesn't sit so well with you to have rejection for these patients, that if it's a small enough number and we're decreasing transplant tourism a lot, it may be worthwhile. In terms of women going abroad to do this, I do think, especially older women or multiple embryo pregnancies. So first of all, again, one issue here has to do with cost, right? Much of medical tourism in the United States is about cost. But in Canada, when it comes to reproductive technologies, and many people are self-pay, the cost of doing it in Canada, the fact that it's not subsidized by the provincial payer in most places except Quebec, I think, is a problem. And you might think that that is a different way of dealing with this, is to actually pay for people to do it here rather than have them go abroad. But I do think that people who, Canada is a communitarian country when it comes to our insurance for health care, right? We all sink or swim together. And if you go abroad and do something that imposes costs on the system, there may be at some point that you have to take responsibility. Now, again, you don't want to take this too far in that people who do drunk driving and hit a tree, right? You don't want to be the penalty for doing something stupid like that to be that you forfeit your life. But nor is it the case that the Canadian taxpayer should be responsible for every activity you undertake that imposes costs, especially because it's not just we're saving money from the bottom line, it's that we're actually going to reallocate a huge amount of resources to you that might be available to other people. But I think this is inherently a democratic conversation. And, there is not necessarily a right answer about where the penalty should lie and how much it should be. But you have as much say more say now. I still pay a little taxes to Canada, but you have more say than I do as a Canadian taxpayer and a beneficiary of the system. You are a co-equal sovereign with this person who goes abroad, and you have a role in generating what the rules of your community will be.
Thank you all for their great conversation. Thanks to Glenn for a very interesting talk. And again, I'd like to thank all the many people who made this Dream Colloquium series and tonight's talk possible. Most importantly, we've got reception. You can corner Glenn to ask him a few more questions, and we'll have some light dessert outside as well. So I hope some of you can stick around to continue the conversation. Thanks.